So before I begin, just again, this is the first time I've given a lecture outside of Ireland in probably almost 10 years, so I'm a little bit nervous, so please bear with me. And as one of my favourite actors, Tom Courtney, said, nerves are the respect that you owe your audience. So if I'm nervous, it's because I respect you greatly. If I'm very nervous, I respect you incredibly. So, now the title of the lecture and the abstract, Tradition Contested, the Rise of Karaite Judaism and its Impact, it's changed a little bit since I first wrote it, which anybody who works in academia knows this. So I'll just get straight into it, and obviously we can have questions afterwards, but hopefully what you're going to get is not going to be too far from what you expected initially. So, introduction. The emphasis of tonight's paper is not on the historicity of the many and varied accounts of the rise of Karaite Judaism and the challenge it presented to its rival, Rabbinite Judaism. Instead, I hope to use the case of the Karaites versus Rabbinites as an example of how religious groups that may claim to the same origin use narratives and nomenclature as a way of discrediting the claims of their rivals, while at the same time reinforcing their own claims to authority and authenticity. We will, of course, discuss something of the origins and nature of Karaite Judaism, but one might say that we are more interested in general questions of authenticity, authority, the construction and maintenance of boundaries, the role played by the other or others in the construction of identity, and how a larger group, in this instance the Rabbinite Jews, can be shaped and impacted by a smaller group, specifically one which they saw as errant and deviant despite themselves. So again, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Karaite Judaism and its rival, but essentially in the context of the Karaite versus what was to become normative rabbinic Judaism, rather than say rabbinic Jews, we usually talk about Karaite versus Rabbinite, but Rabbinite essentially became rabbinic. So onwards and upwards. So part two, the question of naming. So for anybody beginning to engage with Karaite Judaism, one of the most frequently encountered designations for this religious community or group is sect. Within the first sentence of some of the standard reference works, so Encyclopedia Judaica from 2007, the second edition, the Encyclopedia of Religion, second edition 2005, and the Encyclopedia of Islam, second edition, and the particular volume that deals with the Karaim or the Karaites is from 1997, the Karaites are named as a sect. Nemoy's oft-cited Karaite anthology from 1952 describes the Karaites as a sect in his introduction, and Rochwald's key article from 1973, which discusses the Karaites, Samaritans, and the Beta Yisrael, whom the author refers to by the derogatory exonym Falash as, is entitled Marginal Jewish Sects in Israel. Another of the sect designation of Karaite Judaism can be found in a much more recent article by Frank on Karaite exegesis in Salo's multi-volume Hebrew Bible Old Testament, the history of its interpretation, where Frank describes the Karaites as Judaism's oldest surviving sect. A final example is Robert Brody's chapter, The Struggle Against Heresy, which deals with Karaite Judaism in his The Geonim of Babylonia and the Shaping of Medieval Jewish Culture. Now, it's from 1998, but it's been very recently been republished. And he describes the Karaites as a sectarian group. So why, you might ask, am I going to such length in citing sources that refer to Karaite Judaism as a sect? Naming, as any student, especially one of religion, is an incredibly powerful activity. To name something is, in effect, to interpret it. Often, if not always, in academic discourse, the words that we hear or read, casually thrown around, or written, are contested ones. with long periods of unresolved argument, dissent, or rejection, both behind them and indeed ahead of them. The concept of the shibboleth, of course, itself a Hebrew word taken from the narrative in Judges chapter 12, testifies to the power of names and naming in the formation, maintenance, and identification of both self-identity and group identity. To give a contemporary example from my own Irish context, rightly or wrongly, I make certain political and cultural assumptions on the basis of how a person refers to the fourth largest city on the island of Ireland, lying on the River Foyle, as Derry or Londonderry. Very much an Irish shibboleth, which we can go into later if anybody wants to explore that further. The words sect and sectarian, then, have a particular range of connotations, usually negative ones, for the groups so designated. Indeed, does any religious group, except in an ironic fashion, refer to itself as a sect? In religious studies, the sociological distinction between religious groups as churches or sects, developed by Max Weber and Ernst Trusch, is probably the most oft encountered schema. A typical formulation of this distinction is to be found in one of the standard introductions to sociology. Quotation. A church is a large, well-established religious body, like the Catholic Church and the Church of England. A sect is a smaller, less highly organised grouping of committed believers, usually setting itself up in protest against the church, as Calvinists and Methodists have done. I would, of course, as a religionist, replace Giddens' believers with adherents, because we in religious studies don't privilege belief over practice. Issues such as perceived heterodoxy and orthodoxy, heteropraxy and orthopraxy, and indeed the relationship of groups to each other and the wider social context in which they exist, further nuance this basic distinction. Great care must be taken in applying the term sect to a religious group. An awareness of the need for greater precision in nomenclature seems to be more present in the study of the Judaisms, deliberately plural, of the late Second Temple period, one that was often, and still in some quarters, is referred to as a period of Jewish sectarianism. The inadequacy and or inaccuracy of the sectarian model derives from the realization that we may not be able to speak accurately of a single normative form of Judaism, a church in the sociological sense. Again, as a person from Ireland, it's very difficult, even as a sociologist of religion, to use the word church without thinking of the Catholic Church. So forgive that. Yes, to speak accurately of a single normative form of Judaism from which the so-called sects could split or rebel against, rather than seeing the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Zealots as Jewish sects, it might be more helpful to regard them as interpretations of Judaism, or different ways of doing Judaism, with various degrees of mutual recognition, some of which we just can't recover. The Qumranites, or the Essenes, as they're most often identified with, however, would seem in some regards to qualify as a sect in terms of their self-separation from what they saw as the usurpation of the high priesthood of the Jerusalem temple. In referring to the Karaites as a sect, we may be making an error in terms of the social context of Karaite communities, which, just like those of the Rabbinites, were not monolithic entities. Just as there were and are many Judaisms, so too we find many Karaisms. A closer examination of individual Karaite communities reveals a range of different relationships with other Karaites, Rabbinites, and indeed the usually Muslim authorities under which they lived. A set of complex relationships that cannot be reduced to a church sect model. There is also the issue of the aspiration to something approaching academic objectivity. Of course, an aspiration that most scholars have now abandoned in recognition of the impossibility of entirely detaching oneself itself, and the social and cultural location in which one operates. In other words, by using the term sect to describe the Karaites, are we effectively buying into, again apologies for the economic metaphor, the Rabbinite narrative that sees its form of Judaism as normative and that of the Karaites as deviant? We may not consciously be doing so, but to ignore the possibility that we might be is a disservice both to ourselves as thinkers and the Karaites as a group. Polyak, in the preface to the magisterial guide to scholarship of Karaism that she edited, states that that Karaite Judaism is best defined as a Jewish religious movement. And Polyak deliberately avoids the use of the term sect, and indeed cites various articles, particularly one by Jeffrey Kahn, which points out how the term sect, in that sociological sense, is completely inadequate to describe Karaite Judaism. This leads us neatly to our next point. Moving past whether we describe the group as a sect or otherwise, how do we actually name the group and its adherents? Do we use Karaism and Karaites, or do we use the longer phrases Karaite Judaism and Karaite Jew? Like the use of the word sect, great care must be taken in how we name the group and its adherents. To call it Karaism and its adherents Karaites to Kur could suggest, again, often unconsciously, that the group is outside the bounds, or the boundaries of Judaism. That is, Karaites are not actually Jews. Rather they are, and we're going back to familiar territory here, a deviant sect that has split off from Judaism and moved so far away from its parent, if you will, that it constitutes an entirely new religion. We encounter, again, slight digression here, but hopefully relevant to what's going on at the moment in the world, we encounter a similar issue in the nomenclature of the ethno-religious group to which the ruling Assad family of Syria, or what is left of that tragic country and suffering people. This group have long been referred to as Nusayris. However, the group's now favoured self-designation is Alawiyun, or Alawites, in Arabic Alawiyun, or Alids. Now, while Nusayri stresses the group's distance from so-called mainstream Islam, a position held by most Muslim scholars, Alawi, or Alawite, or Alid, stresses their proximity to Shi'i Islam, in which Ali, the Prophet Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, played a major role. However, rather than emphasizing discontinuity, otherness, and subordination, referring to the group as Karaite Judaism and its adherents as Karaite Jews, so I should have said referring to the movement as Karaite Judaism and its adherents as Karaite Jews, emphasizes continuity, commonality, and indeed a measure of equality. That is, the group represents a valid form or indeed interpretation of Judaism, and its adherents are ultimately Jews. By using the names Karaism and Karaites without further qualification, we are, in a sense, privileging the Rabbinite narrative of Karaite deviance. Sources on the group that emerge from insider authors, or indeed scholarly specialists such as Polyak, the leading scholar of Karaism at the moment, tend to favour the fuller name, Karaite Judaism or Karaite Jews. We might say that one of our key, I suppose, maxims or key shibboleths in religious studies, what distinguishes us perhaps from theologians. And again, it's something that one has to constantly do in Ireland, where it's assumed the only people that study religion are theologians. So what sort of theologian are you? And I would say I'm not a theologian, I'm a religionist. Why did I start saying that? There's a particular reason for that designation. Yes, in religious studies we do have a little maxim, which is the adherent is always right. Now, again, if somebody comes up and says, I am a Karaite Jew, we don't say to them, actually, you're not a Jew. you reject the oral Torah, therefore you're a deviant. No, that's not what we do. Again, we're like linguists. We don't prescribe, we describe. Doesn't mean we're uncritical, but we don't, we try to, again, I've mentioned that scholarly objectivity is a somewhat Enlightenment aspiration, but at least we respect the self-designations of groups. I think it's a matter of politeness and good manners. Anyway, back on topic. The word Karaite itself comes to us from the Hebrew Qara'im, most often related to the verb kara, or kara, to read, especially scripture, and the root of one of the Hebrew designations of the Jewish scripture, mikra, i.e. that which is read, or scripture. So, according to this interpretation, we could translate the term Karaite as scripturalist or champion of scripture. The Hebrew verb kara is clearly cognate. I should avoid saying clearly. I'm an academic. We don't say clearly that often. We tend to say perhaps, might be. But I'm saying clearly. I'm nailing my colours to the mast here. Is clearly related or cognate. It's cognate with the Arabic verb kara, to read or recite. Again, of course, the origin of the word Quran. In Arabic, again, and Karaite pretty much Karaite Judaism. Karaite Judaism largely emerged in an Islamic Arabic-speaking context. So, in Arabic, the Karaites were sometimes referred to as Kara'iyun, a term somewhat similar to the Arabic words for a Quran reciter, Kara or Kari. Now, I don't need to suggest here in any sense that the Karaites consciously named themselves thus in order to emphasize a closeness, real or imagined, to Islam, but rather, in an Arabic-speaking Islamic context in which Karaism emerged, namely the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the similarity would have had some resonance indeed. We will pass over the theory that the word Karaite is a possible calque of the Arabic da'i, or caller, or propagandist. But it is certainly noteworthy. Again, why are we passing over that? I think it's a bit fanciful. Okay, it's relating it to the whole thing of Abbasid propaganda. Okay, that which went before the Abbasid revolution. So missionary in a sense. But I think it's definitely noteworthy that the other two Hebrew designations for the adherents of the movement, B'nai Mikra or Ba'alei Mikra, make the connection with Scripture even more explicit. So literally, B'nai Mikra, the children of Scripture, or again, B'nai, children, the adherents of Scripture, or the Ba'alei Mikra, the masters of Scripture in a sense. And it makes it very explicit. So, part two etiological narratives. So, from the point of view of the historian, working with all the methods and expectations of contemporary historiography, the origins of any religious group are often difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct. However, the presentation of a history proper of the origins and rise of Karaite Judaism is not really the purpose of this paper, despite what the abstract might have said. Such a task is indeed beyond the scope of the present context. Detailed historiographic work on the origins of the Karaites, their movement, and its literary productions is a lively, ongoing, and indeed a rapidly growing academic field, and we pretty much have Naira Polayak to thank for that. And its results are becoming widely available to those who wish to investigate that side of it further. My interest, however, this evening, as noted above, is to look at how the Rabbinite Jews and the Karaite Jews constructed themselves and their other through the use of etiological narratives and counter-narratives. Such narratives ultimately aimed to confirm the authenticity and legitimacy of one form of Judaism by denying the authenticity and legitimacy of the other. To this end, we will look at two such narratives. The first of these is a Rabbinite one, which, somewhat ironically, survives only in a Karaite source, while the second one is a Karaite one. Clearly, when two religious groups make exclusivist claims to represent the same truth, a conflict in how they present themselves in relation to the other is inevitable. Both the Karaites and the Rabbinites believed that their own ways of being Jewish were the only valid and authentic ones. Each of them presented themselves as the true Israel, the other a false one. The authenticity of the one rested on the inauthenticity of the other. While it may seem an obvious point, Karaite Judaism and Rabbinite Judaism could only exist as poles on an axis of opposition or a system of difference. As is so often the case, a group, religious or otherwise, is forced to consider its distinct identity and construct, articulate, and indeed police its boundaries when confronted by a challenge, whether that challenge is internal or external. Rabbinite Judaism only had to draw boundaries around itself as Rabbinite Judaism, boundaries that excluded the Karaites, when Karaite Judaism emerged to challenge the hegemony of the Rabbinites, that is, their claims to the their claims to the authority to represent Judaism. A situation, I think, not dissimilar to Orthodox Judaism's need to name itself thus in the face of the emergence of Reform and other forms of non-Orthodox Judaism. So in this section, we are essentially looking at how both groups, Karaites and Rabbinites, utilize narratives as part of their struggle to claim the exclusive authority to present themselves as true Judaism. So, 2.1, a rabbinic Rabbinite narrative of Karaite origins. A widely reproduced anti-Karaite report, sometimes attributed to Saadia Gaon, again another person who's a great interest in me, especially in terms of Judeo-Arabic, but preserved. So this again, a lot of people doubt the attribution to Saadia. Saadia did write an awful lot of anti-Karaite polemic, but whether he actually wrote this one is a moot point. But again, does it matter whether he wrote it or not? I don't think so as a religionist. I think what matters is it has been accepted as being Saadia in its origin. Therefore, it's a certain authority. Anyway, this anti-Karaite report, which we mentioned earlier, is ironically preserved simply in the work of a 12th century Karaite by the name of Elijah ben Abraham, gives a detailed account of the formation of the Karaite movement, or schism, or heresy, from the Rabbinite perspective. This narrative tells how Anan ben David, often identified by the Rabbinites as the heresiarch, and this is something that's uncritically reproduced by some scholarly sources, again, make the exception of Meir de Poliak and various people who work with her, who've moved away from this caricature of Anan as the founder. It's itself a simplification of a far more complex reality. So Anan was a Babylonian sage of Davidic descent who was in line to become exilarch of the Babylonian Jewish community. However, Anan was passed over for the exilarchate in favour of his younger brother, Hananiah, who was less qualified than Anan, but more pious and, we might say, Torah true. As subjects of the Abbasid Caliph, or Caliphate, the exilarch, like any leader of a religious community, a non-Muslim community, was confirmed in their office by the Caliph himself. So, when Anan rejected Hananiah's appointment as exilarch and set himself up as the true exilarch, or again, the anti-exilarch from the perspective of Hananiah's party, with his own group of followers, he was effectively disobeying the Caliph, was arrested and sentenced to death. Now, not sentenced to death for being a heresiarch, but essentially sentenced to death for refusing to recognise the authority of the Abbasid Caliph, quite possibly Al-Mansur, to appoint people. So it was a denial of secular authority rather than a principled objection to the heresy. Anyway, this narrative tells us that while he was in prison awaiting execution, he met a Muslim scholar. And interestingly, a word I tell all my students not to use because interesting is very much a subjective term. In any case, I think it's interesting that while he was in prison, he met a Muslim scholar who is frequently identified with Abu Hanifa al-Nu'man ibn Thabit, the eponym of the Hanafi madhab of Islamic jurisprudence, who died in 767. Abu Hanifa advised Anan to inform the caliph that his schismatic movement, and again I'm using the terms of the narrative which are very much Rabbinite, was a distinct religion from that of his brother of Hananiah, namely Rabbinite Judaism, or of course Judaism, because of course we retroject the terms, don't we? Anan managed to convince the caliph using differences in calendar to support his claims. Now again, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on whether you're interested in calendars, we're not going to enter into the complex and fascinating issue of the calendar as a locus of conflict between various Jewish groups. However, we should note that it is a very, very frequent motif in Rabbinite Karaite polemic. So, this anti-Karaite etiological narrative tells us more about Rabbinite perceptions of the movement than it does about the origins of the movement, and indeed the grounds upon which the Rabbinites sought to undermine the legitimacy of Karaite Judaism, therefore bolstering their own authority and legitimacy. So, first of all, we have a member of the Jewish aristocracy, one of royal Davidic descent, enraged by a temporal rather than a religious matter. So Anan's anger is caused by being passed over for the office of exilar in favour of his younger brother. Now again, anybody familiar with biblical literature will be extremely familiar with the motif of a younger brother surpassing and indeed outsmarting an older one. Is that a deliberate part of the narrative, perhaps? I don't know. Second, Anan's anger at being deprived of an office that he felt was rightfully his led him to gather a group of malcontents who recognised him as their exilar, so that the origins of the movement are again emphasised as being petty, temporal, and vengeful, by no means principled or religious. Third, during Anan's imprisonment awaiting execution for defying caliphal authority, and again I think that's a very important point, he's not imprisoned awaiting execution because he's set up a schismatic group. He's been imprisoned awaiting execution because he has denied the authority of the caliph. So he's advised to save his own life through a lie, namely that the Karaite movement was a distinct religion. So, to his lust for temporal power, petty vengefulness, can be added his founding of the movement as a means to save his own life, namely the life of an individual, not the lives of his followers, who would no doubt have been at risk had he been executed. Such a narrative could be read as suggesting that his fear of death and his dishonest means of avoiding it, through this, that Anan lacked the commitment to be a martyr. A person of principle would surely have died for his religious beliefs, even if judged by his opponents to be errant ones. Fourth, we must also point to the fact that Anan's plan to save his own skin is not even his own. He is advised to undertake this ruse by a non-Jew, namely a Muslim. Anan emerges from this Rabbinite portrait as a heresiarch who is petty, devious, unprincipled, lacking any integrity and devoid of any religious conviction. His heretical, schismatic sect is founded not on any legitimate or principled disagreement with the position of the Rabbinites. Rather, it is a rancorous vehicle for his own base jealousy and cowardly fear of execution. This damning portrait of Anan is reinforced by the 12th century Rabbinite chronicler Abraham ibn Daud, which also explicitly mentions the rejection of the oral Torah as a key feature of the movement. And we're going to say a little bit more on the oral Torah presently. So, quotation. Moved by envy and hatred, which took hold of his heart, he, Anan, proceeded to build up a sandhill of heresy and to seduce Israel from the tradition of the sages. He composed books, set up his own disciples, and he invented out of his own heart laws which were not good and judgments by which men could not live in righteousness. And again, I think the motif of seduction is very, very important. Anybody who has read Deuteronomy will talk about, there will be false prophets in the future, and they will try to seduce Israel from the righteous path laid out by Torah as given to Moses at Sinai. And what do we do with these false prophets? We as Israel execute them, okay? Because, they're trying to lead Israel astray. They're trying to seduce Israel. Anyway, back out of the quotation. That wasn't part of the quotation. Anan is presented by Rabbinites, and indeed some contemporary sources, and this is where I have something of an issue with the privileging of the Rabbinite narrative. Now, not because I think the Karaite narrative is true. To be quite honest, I don't care which is true. It's of no interest to me. What's interesting to me is the use of narratives, okay? In any case, many of these contemporary sources present, uncritically, Anan as the founder or heresiarch of Karaite Judaism. However, the Karaite Jews themselves do not share this position, however much it may or may not represent historical reality. And again, there's been a lot of contemporary work done on Anan and his actual role. A number of the Karaite sources actually condemn Anan. What it reminds me of, I'll talk about later, I'll get on like this. They do, however, hold Anan in some high esteem, as we shall see on Elm. Obviously, as a group that sees itself as the true Israel, the foundation of Karaite Judaism cannot be attributed to a single human. Rather, like the Rabbinites, the Karaites saw their religion as being divine in its origin. Al-Kirpisani, first half of the 10th century, one of the greatest Karaite scholars, in his Kitab al-Anwar al-Maratib, written in Arabic, because of course Karaism emerged in 8th century Baghdad, as most the historical consensus would have. And again, most of the Karaites wrote in Arabic. Now, I'm avoiding the term Judeo-Arabic because I've got certain issues with the distinction. I think most of these people wrote in what we can correctly refer to as Fusha, or classical Arabic. If they wrote it in Hebrew script, does that make it a different language? I think it might make it a lect, and even to call it an ethnolect may be pushing it, but maybe that's something we can discuss in the context of trying to Judeo-Arabic. Anyway, the first part of Al-Kirpisani's book describes the development of various Jewish groups, and indeed Christianity. Obviously, he's writing in the first half of the 10th century. What does Al-Kirpisani say of Anan? He says he was the exilarch in the days of the Caliph Al-Mansur. So, the first point to make is, clearly, Al-Kirpisani accepts Anan's claim to be the exilarch. And he was the first to reveal the whole truth about the laws. He was learned in the teachings of the Rabbinites, none of whom could impugn his learning. Now, before we go on to a little bit of analysis of that, I'd just like to say that when Al-Kirpisani says he was the first to reveal the whole truth about the laws, I think it's pretty clear that the laws were revealed to Moses at Sinai, and rather than being the first person to reveal the whole truth, we might compare him to the role of Muhammad in Islam, not as the founder of Islam, but rather the restorer of primordial, pristine Islam, which had somehow been distorted by non-Muslims. So the whole notion of tahrif, or distortion. Anyway, so Anan, again, direct quotation over. So Anan is here presented as the true exilarch, not his brother, and a scholar who accessed the truth of Torah, a truth that already existed, but needed to be rediscovered or recovered. So significantly, Anan is not the founder of Karaite Judaism. Rather, he is a restorer of Judaism to its pristine state. There again, I think the comparison with Muhammad is germane. Also, Anan's learning is presented as being equal to that of the Rabbinites, and indeed is seen as being very familiar with their sources. It's beyond the scope of this paper to address in detail the often-counted foundation of Karaism, or the often-encountered attribution of the foundation of Karaism to Anan. However, we can observe that his role in Karaite Jewish etiological narratives is an ambiguous one. Indeed, how could it not be so? If indeed Karaite Judaism is the authentic form of Judaism, originating from the Torah at Sinai, the Torah given to Moses at Sinai, how could the group's foundation be attributed to a single human being, however learned? And actually the comparison I was trying to think of earlier was the so-called the so-called Nestorians, who split off, who would claim to be the true form of Christianity, who don't accept the teachings of the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus. Now, they're commonly called Nestorians by outsiders, but of course they reject the designation because they would say, we do not accept the teachings of Nestorius. That's another story. 2.2, a Karaite narrative of rabbinic origins. Given that the Rabbinites saw themselves as the true Israel and the inheritors of the perfect Torah given to Moses at Sinai, which would say a little bit more below, it is clear that any Karaite claim to the same status must, of its very nature, challenge that Rabbinite claim of exclusive authenticity. Again, we turn to Al-Kirgisani's Kitab. As a Karaite Jew, we can assume that Al-Kirgisani accepted that Karaite Judaism was the only authentic form of Judaism. All others were indeed deviant to some extent or other. In chapter 2 of the Kitab, which offers a chronological account of the various, from a Karaite perspective, sects to split from Judaism, Al-Kirgisani traces the ultimate roots of heresy, the Rabbinite heresy, back to Jeroboam, first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Again, long quotation here, but I think it's worthwhile. The first to show dissension in the Jewish religion, to sow disobedience to the Torah amongst the people of Israel, subsequent to the establishment of the monarchy, to alter the divine ordinances and to supplant them, was Jeroboam, since Scripture says of him, in more than one place, the sins of Jeroboam, wherewith he has made Israel to sin. And we find a whole range of citations, 1 Kings 14:16, 1 Kings 15:30, and so on. I won't bore you before this. This refers to his making 2 golden calves and to his call to the people, ye have gone up long enough to Jerusalem, 1 Kings 12:28. According to Scripture, his motive for doing this was his desire to establish himself in his kingdom and endure in it, and his fear that if the people continued to travel to Jerusalem for the festivals, they might long again for the legitimate king of the house of David, so that Jeroboam's kingdom would slip out of his hand. And then the quotation ends with a very long quotation, 1 Kings 12:26-28, and it's only 2 verses long, but they're very long verses. End of quotation. There are interesting parallels here to the Rabbinite narrative of Karaite origins. Jeroboam's motives are not truly religious or principled. They are utterly worldly and self-interested. There is also a parallel in the motif of rejection of legitimate authority. In the case of Jeroboam, the legitimate king of the house of David, Al-Kirgisani goes on to state that following Jeroboam's reign, dissent arose among the children of Israel, and similar deviant practices were planted in their midst, one generation inheriting them from the other. Al-Kirgisani presents the reader with his chronological list of the largely deviant groups to emerge from Judaism. So, after Jeroboam come the Samaritans, and a group whom he calls the chiefs of the community, who are the original Rabbinites, quotation marks, during the Second Temple period. Al-Kirgisani identifies Simeon the righteous of the first of this group to be attested in the written record. He then offers a description of the principal errors of the Rabbinites. Now, before we read the quotation, I think it's quite clear that by the chiefs of the community, he is referring to the Pharisees, who were ultimately, well, we could say that the compilers of the Talmud, the editors and the redactors, ultimately saw themselves as the logical successors, the legitimate successors of the Pharisees. Anyway, back to the direct quotation from Al-Kirgisani. The Rabbinites acknowledged the authority of the chiefs of the community, and my emphasis, solely because they followed the practices and indulgences inherited from Jeroboam. In particular, they sustained and confirmed these practices, supplied them with argumentative proofs, and wrote down the interpretation of them in the Mishnah and in other works. Al-Kirkasani here not only rejects the divinely revealed status of the oral Torah, which could have been dismissed as human in origin, yet possibly of interest or some sort of source of edification. Indeed, as we've already been told, Anan had studied the Talmud, i.e. the codification of the oral Torah, and surpassed most Rabbinite scholars in knowledge of it. In any case, he states that the oral Torah of the Rabbinites is, quite simply, an exercise in sophistry, an intellectual attempt to provide legitimacy for what is manifestly untrue, dangerous, and damaging, namely, quotation, the practices and the indulgences inherited from Jeroboam. End of quotation. So, from Al-Kirkasani's perspective, Rabbinite Judaism is ultimately a deviant and errant movement built on the consciously distorting teachings of heretics who follow in the line of Jeroboam, their heresiarch. However, Al-Kirkasani's negative portrait of the Rabbinites is not without some concession to the integrity of some individuals. Quotation, at times, one or another among them did set forth the true meaning of biblical ordinance, but they invariably banished him and sought to do him an injury, as was, for example, the case of Gamaliel, again, the calendar, who fixed the date of holidays on the basis of the appearance of the new moon. End of quotation. This concession, of course, has quite the sting in its tail. On those rare occasions that an individual Rabbinite scholar came close to the truth as embodied in Karaism, what did the Rabbinites do? They tried to silence him through exile, or indeed worse. Part 3. The rejection of tradition. Karaite Judaism is characterized by a number of features. A contemporary attempt to describe the movement is that of, well, probably guessing at this stage something I'm very fond of, Mayor Poliak, and cited partly above. She says, in her introduction, I would suggest that Karaism is best defined as a Jewish religious movement of a scripturalist and messianic nature, which crystallized in the second half of the 9th century in areas of Persia, Iraq, and Palestine. End of quotation. In using the word scripturalist, Poliak has positively formulated the most commonly cited, and indeed perhaps the defining feature of Karaite Judaism, which I've avoided up until now. That is, its rejection of the oral Torah, Torah Shebet Al-Peh, as a valid source for the formulation of halakha, that is Jewish law. Poliak's positive formulation, defining Karaite Judaism in terms of what it is significant. The majority of sources, especially the standard reference works, which I've mentioned above, express this negatively, and indeed I've just done so by using the word rejection. In these sources, the Karaites are to be understood in terms of what they do not do. That is, they do not accept the oral Torah. To be a Karaite Jew, then, is to be non-Rabbinite, deviant, other, errant. The contemporary study of Karaism is moving away from this passive paradigm of the study of Karaite Judaism, presenting the Karaite movement mainly in terms of what the passive paradigm is that which has been current up to now, which is mainly one that presents the movement in terms of what non-Karaites have said and thought about it, towards a more active paradigm. Again, we turn to Poliak's preface. Karaism, in its spiritual essence and in the grain of its history, should be regarded, in my view, it's a view I share, as an integral stream of Judaism, or alternatively, as one manifestation of the multifaceted nature of Jewish culture and identity. In order to get a better sense of the implications, again from a rabbinite perspective, of the strictly scripturalist nature of Karaite Judaism, it is necessary to say something of the centrality of the doctrine, narrative, legend, what you will, of the doctrine of the dual Torah, how important that is to rabbinite Judaism. In essence, this doctrine holds that when the Torah was revealed to Moses at Sinai, it was given in two media: written, Torah Shebektav, and oral, Torah Shebe'al Peh. The written Torah is the scripture, while the oral Torah is the tradition. Maimonides, again 12th to early 13th century, outlines this doctrine of the dual Torah in the introduction to his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah, supporting its validity by citing scriptural texts. Now, his citing of scriptural text to support the authority of the oral Torah is not without significance, and it's a point that we're going to return to in the conclusion. And here we have the direct quotation from Maimonides, or Musa ibn Maimun, as he would have been known to his fellows. All the precepts which Moses received on Sinai were given together with their interpretation, as it is said, scriptural citation. And I will give to you the tablets of stone and the law and commandment. So this is Exodus 24:12. Go back to Maimonides. The law refers to the written law, the commandment to its interpretation. God bade us to fulfill the law in accordance with the commandment. This commandment refers to that which is called the oral law, or the oral Torah. The commandment, which is the interpretation of the law, he did not write down, but gave a charge concerning it to the elders, to Joshua, and the rest of Israel, as it is said, quotation, all this which I command you, that you shall do, you shall not add to, nor diminish from it. Deuteronomy 4:2. Hence, and this is Maimonides, hence it is styled the oral law. Again, we can find resonances with the famous quotation from Avot. Moses received the Torah from Sinai, he transmitted it to Joshua, who transmitted it to the elders, who transmitted it to the prophets, who transmitted it to the men of the Great Assembly. Again, this is most often cited as the support for the doctrine of the transmission of the oral Torah. In any case, the doctrine of the dual Torah is sometimes misunderstood in an overly simplistic and caricatured fashion, as if Moses received every single word of the Mishnah and Talmud along with the written Torah. The Talmud itself shows that the rabbis had a far more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the doctrine in a very famous, very vivid narrative. This is from Menachot 29b, direct quotation. When Moses ascended on high, having died, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, engaged in attaching crownlets to the letters. Now again, anybody familiar with Hebrew will know that in the scrolls, the Torah scrolls as used in synagogues, certain letters, the Shatz, Netz letters, all have these small crownlets, or tagim. It's just the rule of Hebrew orthography and scrolls. So these are tiny little additions. He said to him, Moses said to him, Lord of the universe, why should you bother with this, i.e. these little tiny signs? Lord of the universe, God answered, there is a man who is destined to arise at the end of many generations, named Akiva ben Yosef, who will expound upon each crownlet heaps and heaps of laws. Moses said to him, Master of the universe, show him to me. He replied, turn around. Moses went and sat down behind the 8 rows of students and listened to the discourse, but he could not understand what they were saying. Now, any of us who lecture are probably very familiar with that feeling. His strength left him, by which the the Talmud is saying he got very upset. His strength left him. But then they came to a certain topic, and the disciple said to Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi, how do you know it, i.e. a particular point of law? He replied, it is a law given to Moses at Sinai. And Moses was comforted. So he went from his state of being weak at heart to being comforted. So end of quotation. So the oral Torah given to Moses at Sinai, along with the written Torah, contains the seed of further rabbinic activity and expansion. And as the great Gershom Scholem put it, puts it, direct quotation, revelation comprises everything that will ever be legitimately offered to interpret its meaning, i.e. the meaning of revelation. Sholem then quotes from the medieval Midrash Tanchuma, Torah, Mishnah, Talmud, and Agada. Indeed, even the comments some bright student will make to their teacher were already given to Moses on Mount Sinai. It's a very profound explanation, a very nuanced explanation of the nature of oral Torah, which is so often caricatured. I'm not coming down on the Rabbinite side there, just in case anyone sort of abandoned my answer, despite myself. Rab Amram, second half of the 9th century, typically for a Rabbinite, places the Karaite rejection of the oral Torah at the center of his description of the errant nature of Karaite Judaism, along with the creation of Rabbinite Judaism by Anan ben David, which is again this probably ahistorical one, given that so many Karaite accounts reject Anan as the founder. Okay, yeah, again, they afford him a certain respect as one who perhaps came to certain elements of the truth of Torah, but he's a rediscoverer or restorer of it rather than the actual founder of it. Now, some more cynical historians will say, oh yes, this is an attempt by the Karaites to distance themselves from the notorious heresy Organa. Anyway, it's another day's talk. Rab Amram cites the Suran Gaon, Natronai ben Helai, from the mid-9th century, as his source. So here we have a quotation from Amram. These men, namely the Karaites, are heretics and scoffers who hold in contempt the word of the scholars, and who are disciples of Anan. Now the scholars are, of course, the rabbis, the editors who dabbed yourself in the Talmud. Who had said, so this is Anan, who had said to those who strayed, and here we have seduction again, and were seduced to follow him, so this is a quotation attribution to Anan, forsake ye the words of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and I will compose for you a Talmud of my own. End of attribution quotation. We're back to Amram. To this day, they remain in error and have become a people unto themselves, while he fabricated an evil and wicked Talmud for himself. My master, Eliezer Aluf, has seen this abominable book with his own eyes, of which they call the Book of Precepts. It's the Sefer Mitzvot, the Book of Commandments, and it contains many heretical deceptions. So, part 4. We're coming near the end for anybody who's really there's only 2 pages left. Karaite Judaism, defeated or victorious? Question mark. I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to pose the question. I'm going to problematize. So, given that Karaite Jews believe that Scripture is the sole valid source of halakha, it is inevitable that their scholars placed a greater emphasis on the study of Tanakh, or the Mikra, than their rabbinite counterparts, for whom the oral Torah was indeed the main object of study. Elijah Basharchi, again 15th century from Edirne, contemporary Turkey, in his Aderet Eliyahu, the mantle of Elijah, which is Karaite law code, we can compare it to the Shulchan Aruch. 3 decades in the making, but again it remains incomplete in his death. And at his death, again, I think anybody who's an old school academic will realise that it can take 3 decades to work on a project, even though a lot of contemporary universities are like, is this the first quartile journal that you're publishing in? In fact, yes, my own place of, well, I better not say anything about the scene there. It's great. So, the 6th of these 10 principles states that it is, you can edit that bit out, the 6th of these 10 principles states that, quotation, it is the duty of the believer to know the language of the Torah and its interpretation, end quotation. Basharchi, in his commentary on this 6th principle, goes on to justify the centrality of Hebrew, condemn over-reliance on translations of sacred texts, not a condemnation of translation per se, it should be noted, rather an over-reliance on these translations, rather than translations as such. He also includes a detailed and extremely practical curriculum for the study of the Hebrew language, one that I think would meet many module descriptors in contemporary universities. So, Karaite Judaism, through its emphasis on the Tanakh and the need to understand it in its original Hebrew, led to the growth of the serious and systematic study of Hebrew language and the transmission and preservation of the text of the Tanakh. Now, I've kind of almost written out the contributions that the Karaites themselves made to the development of scientific linguistics themselves and the study of the text. Now, the Leningrad Codex, the oldest extant text of the whole Tanakh, dating from around 1000 CE, one often gets the 1008 date. I've seen it as 1001 in some sources. Anyway, which was produced in Egypt, which was indeed a great centre of Karaism, offers us probably the best example of the Masoretic text of the Tanakh. Now, the Aleppo Codex is older, but it's incomplete. I should mention that my initial training was by Ireland's, and in fact one of the world's leading text critics, specifically of the book of Deuteronomy, Carl McCarthy, who has just, in recent years, published, I think, I would say that, the best critical edition of the text of Deuteronomy in the Biblica Hebraica Quinta series. Advertisement over. This codex, the Leningrad Codex, was acquired by the Karaite manuscript collector Abraham Firkovich, who died in 1874. The codex comes from the tradition of the Ben Asher Masoretes, and again, most people, with a few small exceptions, accept that the Ben Asher family and tradition were indeed Karaites. Now again, unsurprising given their emphasis on the centrality of Scripture that they would have such an emphasis on its correct transmission. That's not to suggest Rabbinites were uninterested in it. The Karaites were also productive in the field of biblical exegesis. Again, their exegesis has often been presented as excessively literalistic, but I believe it's better characterized as part of the linguistic/peshat tendency of Rabbinite Jewish biblical exegesis. And again, personal sidebar, I first came to the Karaites through my study of Rashi's commentary on Deuteronomy, which again, it's often described as, you know, the pioneering text in terms of the development of so-called peshat interpretation, i.e. plain sense. I think it's better described perhaps as linguistic rather than plain sense. And again, peshat is often contrasted, as I'm sure many of you know, with derash interpretation, i.e. midrashic, homiletical interpretation, which, on close reading of Rashi's text, I think is better characterized as literary, in any case. I think very much Karaite exegesis belongs to that. And of course, many of the Karaites were amongst the first people to translate sections of the Bible into Arabic from the original Hebrew. Saudi's tafsir, which is a translation of the complete Tanakh into Arabic, often gets top billing. Okay? But the Karaites were translating sections of the Hebrew Bible from a very early stage. Now, their translations are often dismissed as being overly literalistic. Again, I think that often comes from people who haven't actually read them. They're not overly literalistic. They are quite sophisticated in their own way. Again, enough of that. Sidebar over. In responding to the challenge posed by Karaite Judaism, a challenge firmly, if not entirely rooted in Scripture, Mikra, the Rabbinite majority had to respond in terms that the Karaites would accept, at least theoretically, namely scriptural ones. So it's a little bit like how the Mu'tazilites were, I suppose, challenged by the non-Mu'tazilite majority of Muslims, i.e. they brought in the Greco-Roman, Platonic, Neoplatonic philosophy to defeat them intellectually. In any case, Karaite Judaism, despite itself, again, it's one of my favourite phrases, caused Rabbinite Judaism to refocus itself on the study of the Tanakh and its language. This refocusing was to usher in a period of significant Rabbinite Jewish linguistic and exegetical activity. And it's linguistic and exegetical activity which in most of the histories is overemphasized in favor of that of the Rabbinites. So it's a kind of a hidden history. So, while Karaite Judaism lost the competition, to use a somewhat lazy analogy of competition, we might venture to suggest that if Karaite Judaism aimed to refocus Judaism on its scriptures, again, it's a bit of a caricature, But again, part of our job as educators is to resize complexity, isn't it? And construct models, which we then move beyond. So if it was Karaite Judaism's aim to refocus Judaism on its scriptures, it certainly did not lose the competition to continue that dreadful metaphor. 5, conclusion. The Karaite-Rabbinite dispute provides us with what I think is an excellent case study of a religion challenged from within, and its reaction to that challenge. Although its origins were more complex, the Karaite challenge to Rabbinite Judaism has come to be understood as one that questioned the traditional loci of religious authority. We've already noted how groups often develop a need to articulate a sense of their distinctive identity when challenged from within. External challenges can be easily met by recourse to an us versus them dynamic. However, what happens when the them is part of us and challenges the legitimacy and authority of the larger group? This is, of course, a far more serious challenge. In this regard, we might conclude that the Karaites unintentionally strengthened the edifice they sought to, I was originally going to say destroy, but I think I might better say challenge, by forcing their Rabbinite rivals to articulate and demarcate their boundaries, thereby acquiring an even stronger sense of their own identity, consolidating their fundamental principles. Thank you very much.